Hello, and welcome to another edition of Shaking Up Kenosha. My name is Jeff Roberts, and I'll be your host for this series of programs. Today's topic is one that I have discussed many times in the past, but never really got around to producing an actual show until now. As everyone, unless you lived under a rock, you would know, this is a general election year. We're voting for the office of President of the United States, plus senators and representatives and so forth. We've all heard a lot of rhetorical nonsense coming out of Washington, D.C., the campaign trail, and the president and former candidates for office. But this is one mid-year checkpoint for 2016 I think we need to take advantage of. And it's time when America is getting ready to celebrate her birthday with fireworks, barbecues, concerts, vacations to the farthest corners of this great country and beyond. We all have many things to be thankful for, many traditions that were formed strictly in America, but can be enjoyed by just about everybody, especially the constant flow of visitors to our great nation. So it's time to start off with a bit of Americana. Now, I thought it'd be apropos to do something on the topic of America and our nation's birthday. You may remember that I did a 6-part series on the United States Constitution a few years ago, and then a segment on the Civil War and the reenactors that take part in that event annually here in Kenosha. Recently, my family and I and several hundred visitors to Kenosha witnessed an artillery demonstration and a lecture on the capabilities of the Union and Confederate armies during the Civil War and how well they fought or didn't with the pieces of equipment that they had. We've witnessed many different pages of history and events like the Civil War, the War for Independence, and a host of others. But there are many, many more pieces of history, American history, than just war. So let's take a few moments and revisit some of that history. The length and breadth of American history is astounding when you consider it as a whole. Our history begins with the settlements of Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth Rock in 1620. The Jamestown colony was chartered in 1606 as the Virginia Company of London. In 1607, with only 3 ships, Captain Christopher Newport landed on the Virginia coast with just over 100 passengers and a whole lot of dreams. Problem is, those dreams are nearly crushed as soon as the colonists landed in the New World. This was due to the location of the colony itself. The site that was selected was in the middle of Native American territory, of which there were over 14,000 located in and around the Jamestown colony. The Jamestown colony suffered through severe droughts, famine, lack of potable water, disease, unrest between the native Indian tribes, and there were many that were very, very close by. But through it all, American colonies found a way to thrive and survive. It all came about when Captain John Smith decided to scrap the mercantile system which was used in Britain. He did this when he took over the Jamestown colony in 1608. Coincidentally, that was the year 2 English women arrived at the colony. Many more would follow, but the ratio was always more men than women in the Jamestown colony. For those who don't realize, America had its first touch with socialism during that period, and it nearly cost the settlers their lives. That is, until Captain John Smith declared when he assumed command of the colony, "Don't work, don't eat." But more on that later. It was in 1620 when the New England colony of Plymouth Rock was first founded. The movements of pilgrims and settlers from Europe continued well into the 20th century, partly due to the success of those 2 colonies, Jamestown and Plymouth Rock. When the Plymouth Rock colony first started, there were approximately 102 passengers aboard a 106-foot-long sailing ship, the Mayflower, along with 30 crew members. The path to the New World was filled with delays, sailing on treacherous seas, multiple leaks that sprung up inside the Mayflower's hull, rumors of sabotage from other ships and their crews to prevent that journey from taking place. Once the pilgrims arrived at the colony site, the women and children had to live aboard the Mayflower for safety. Although living conditions aboard the ship were much less than even squalor. Food was scarce, fresh water the same. The lack of permanent shelter caused considerable hardship for the pilgrims throughout their very first winter. And adding to the fact, Pilgrims were not supposed to have landed at that location. They had no authority to be there and had to develop the famous Mayflower Compact in order to decide how to run the colony and what to do next. The final decision was like any other town. You would run this particular colony just like any English city. Many legends have arisen from the accounts of the early years of the Plymouth colony, but due to the settlers' ability to adapt to harsh living conditions, perseverance, and help from local Native American tribes, the colony was able to survive. Barely, but it did. Today we celebrate Thanksgiving in honor of the spirit of those Plymouth settlers. Despite all the trials and tribulations, two colonies suffered through in the following years. They were the first American colonies to actually flourish and grow, albeit slowly, but they did grow. Now, we've heard many of the horror stories from the colonies and how they actually survived, or didn't. One thing is certain, the early colonists had seen their share of trials and tribulations throughout the period of growing settlements and the beginning of our nation. Here to explain the economics adopted by those early Americans is Larry Swingart of the University of Dayton. I think this assessment is very revealing and should stand the test of time as a model for all America, especially during this election year. So here's Larry to give us his insight.
Americans didn't invent free market capitalism, but you might say they perfected it. In doing so, they created more wealth for more people than any society in the history of the world. To begin to understand this fascinating and complex story, we have to travel back in time to the very first settlers of America. But before we get to the history, let me define what I mean by capitalism. It's not an easy term to pin down because it developed over thousands of years of human interaction. Adam Smith, the great English thinker, first described it in his famous 1776 treatise, The Wealth of Nations, but he didn't invent it. For our purposes here, I define capitalism as an economic system in which individuals freely decide what they will produce and who they will serve. Since both parties have to consent, it's a system in which success demands that you serve the needs of others before you are rewarded for your work. Now back to history. When the first settlers arrived at Jamestown in 1607, then Plymouth in 1620, they were operating under an economic system common to all European nations at that time known as mercantilism. Under mercantilism, businesses, especially in the colonies, were operated for the benefit of the state. While governments permitted the companies to make profits, their primary purpose was to advance the national interest of England or Spain or France. The early American settlements were set up to be self-sufficient, so that the English government didn't have to support them. And they had to stake out territory. That was key to the colonial game. If England held the territory, Spain and France didn't. The early colonists began their adventure with what they thought was a beautiful idea. They set up a common storehouse of grain from which people were supposed to take what they needed and put back what they could. Lands were also held in common and were worked in common. The settlers owned no land of their own. Though there was no name for this system, it was an ideal socialist commune. And you can probably guess what happened. It began to fall apart almost immediately. As the colonists learned, when everyone is entitled to everything, no one's responsible for anything. A colonist who started his workday early or stayed late received the same provision of food as a colonist who showed up late, went home early, or didn't work at all. After about 2 years, the settlement was reduced to eating shoelaces and rats. Half of them died of starvation. Captain John Smith, of Pocahontas fame, took control of the colony and scrapped the socialist model. Each colonist received his own parcel of land. Private property had come to the New World. He who won't work won't eat, Smith told them, citing the biblical admonition. Well, they worked and they ate, and the colony was saved. The same story unfolded further north, in the Plymouth colony 10 years later. Although this was a Puritan colony with religious goals, its plan was the same as Jamestown's, and it also failed. As its young governor, William Bradford, noted, By adopting the communal system, we thought we were wiser than God. So they quickly abandoned the commune for private ownership. Soon they had an abundance, which they celebrated with a holiday we now know as Thanksgiving. Over the next 150 years, this hard-learned lesson that men should be responsible for their own economic fate became conventional wisdom in the colonies. The American Revolution was largely fought over the burden that British mercantilism placed on the colonies. Two unpopular taxes, the Stamp Act and the Tea Act, are well-known examples. The Americans saw the British government regulating and controlling almost all of their economic activities and didn't like it. Now, it's true that even after gaining independence, none of the founders could be called capitalists. The idea of capitalism as a description of an economic system was only just beginning to be discussed in America. Yet many of the most influential founders intuitively gravitated toward free market principles. Thomas Jefferson's ideas of private land ownership shaped the famous Land Ordinance of 1785 that made public land available to private citizens. While Alexander Hamilton's concepts of individual responsibility and sanctity of contracts could be seen in the Panic of 1791-92, in which he steadfastly refused to allow the U.S. government to bail out bankers who had triggered the panic. Benjamin Franklin, of course, had practiced capitalism all his life with his printing business and with his maxims in Poor Richard's Almanac. The Constitution itself is awash in core concepts of a free market, sanctity of contracts, freedom of expression, powerful limits on the government's ability to regulate or tax, an emphasis on paying debts, and so on. In short, it was the wisdom of experience, not academic ideology, that created America's free market principles. The result has been the most prosperous and free nation in the history of the world. I'm Larry Swikart of the University of Dayton for Prager University.
Welcome back. America has been at the forefront of many new innovations for the conduct of peace and for war. America was busy trying to build itself into a nation all during the 18th century through to the end of the 19th century. Remember, it wasn't until the latter part of the 19th century that America actually became a world power. America as a people, as a society, and as a nation have struggled to make our own way for generations before becoming a leader of the free world, if that's what we call ourselves. This nation has had its humble beginnings as a loose group of colonies that bickered back and forth for everything from taxes, sales of goods and services across the pond with Europe, and even to a marriage that was legal from one colony to the neighboring colony. That one's still under debate at times. We fought two wars with England over independence and another to prevent American citizens from being captured and imprisoned or used as sailors on British ships, and England's constant interference with free trade in North America. Now remember, in those days, let's set the Wayback Machine, there was no telephone, no telegraph, no electrical appliances, or any modern conveniences whatsoever. The Postal Service made deliveries via seafaring ships, couriers, and overland wagon trains. All manufacturing was done by hand, by the crudest methods, and the lack of technology made craftsmen of many Americans. Progress was at a snail's pace for everything. If you didn't make it yourself, or have someone in the village you lived in do it for you, you had to sell or trade something for it. As a last resort, you had to order it from Europe. An order like that could be, or had to be, the most simplest type of construction. It was manufactured and then shipped, and it could take months to arrive. If what you needed was very complex at all, you had to wait for 6 months to a year, and sometimes longer for it to arrive. And there were a few, if any, guarantees that what you ordered would even work at all. Remember, everything was written instructions and crude drawings. Payment for goods that were special order had to be made in advance, and usually in full. There was no continuity of laws or protective services between the colonies, or even a reliable form of transportation in early America. The few American roads that existed at the time were rutted, they were muddy, and in most places so overgrown they seemed to disappear altogether. Wagons pulled teams of mules, oxen, and horses, and it took all day long to travel 20 miles. And that was about the limit of the wagons, and they broke down frequently. particularly due to the horrible conditions of the roads and the pathways that they were used on, and leading out west, it was partially due to the lack of repair parts along the way. There just wasn't anything to fix them with. Wagons had to be repaired with spare parts that were brought along with the wagon trains or fashioned from raw materials along the way. The terrain and weather conditions hampered any efforts to gain momentum during those journeys out west. You were stuck, however slow you were. Now, just arriving and surviving some of the wars with Native Americans and other settlers, and in the Civil War forced many adaptations to the settlers as they moved out west. But technology fueled one success after another, and that proved that American manufacturing was evolving, and evolving very rapidly. Steam power for overland and waterway transportation became the standard. As steam power fueled the railroads and ships, it only took a few years before the technology began to catch up with the settlers who had moved on the journey out westward. From the East Coast to the West Coast, the railroads began to shape how we traveled after the horrors of the Civil War. Steel and iron manufacturing began to steadily climb into the prominence, and the Industrial Revolution was in full swing in America. From the Spartan beginnings of travel in America to the luxury rail cars that brought passengers, freight cars laden with raw materials and finished goods to all corners of the nation, it was over a century railroads, banks, and manufacturing barons actually ruled America. The political climate of Washington, D.C. changed frequently, but the money flowed into the coffers of the companies that were willing to take chances and establish an empire. America was flexing her collective manufacturing prowess and her muscle and winning the race to establish herself as a premier world power. By the close of the 19th century, America had become what was an infant nation that no one took seriously to a nation that established itself as a world manufacturing and military power. During the 20th century, we were faced with two world wars that tested our mettle and capabilities to adapt, our ability to defend ourselves and keep our allies safe as we could make them. Along the way, we have advanced in science, aeronautics, shipbuilding, food production, pharmaceuticals, automotive technology, engineering, and those are just a few areas of our expertise. Americans built dams, roads, improved infrastructure during the worldwide depression of the 1930s, and somehow we just kept plowing forward, albeit slow, but we kept moving forward. And it was an American spirit that propelled an American pilot by the name of Chuck Yeager faster than the speed of sound, and landed a man by the name of Neil Armstrong on the moon. We've propelled ourselves into the 21st century faster and more efficiently than any other time in our nation's history. But safety and security have come at a high cost, and that was a very high cost. America and her allies have been involved in numerous military and peacekeeping actions across the globe. We've fought a war with old enemies, watched several fall from power just to be replaced by even more ridiculous radicals, and that cycle continues today. American troops have chased terrorists across the globe, caught a few, but a few of them have slipped through. Despite deploying military firepower as we felt necessary, we have endured the aftermath of terrorist activity, including that of within our own borders, and have suffered tremendous losses, like in New York's Twin Towers, the Pentagon, Fort Hood, Texas, and on several college campuses. Sadly, even Hollywood mouthpieces like Julianne Moore have chimed in their 2 cents worth, all for publicity, of course. Miss Moore marched in a parade recently, back in May, crossing the Brooklyn Bridge in protest of gun violence. The marchers decided to protest against having ownership of assault weapons. The idiots don't realize there was no such thing as an assault weapon. That was a term coined by Democrats during the Clinton administration, when the so-called assault rifles were successfully banned, albeit foolishly. But violent crime continued to rise unabated, despite the gun control claims to the contrary. The ban had no effect on crime whatsoever, especially in areas like the gun-free zones at schools and other public institutions. Where was Miss Moore and all the anti-gun protesters when a convicted criminal who was out on parole, who was also an illegal alien, who also killed a visiting pregnant woman on the streets of San Francisco in cold blood, in a so-called gun-free zone? Why are all of the civil rights protesters so quiet after some scumbag murders another innocent victim? Or the protesters who shout, "Black Lives Matter," where were they? Why did we not hear some sort of outrage from those brain jackasses who were trying to see and use race as their crutch when a pregnant woman is murdered for her purse? Was it because the criminal was a minority? The answer, of course, is yes, he was. We are all human beings, all of us. All lives should matter. And all the protesters from Ferguson, why were you looting and burning shops from your own neighborhoods? Is it not true you were protesting because you were promised payment to do it by Acorn and several other organizations, run some of them by George Soros? Many more events have shaped our national conscience and will continue to do so far into the future, unfortunately. However, today's world is ruled by innovations by American scientists who invented the microchip, the semiconductor, computers of all types, sizes, shapes, and forms, cell phones. We have advances in medicine technologies, engineering, exploration, and nearly every field of endeavor known to mankind. It's continued to shape the world we currently live in as we know it. The opportunities continue to present themselves each and every day, and despite all that we as a society and nation have accomplished, we still have to deal with fools who insist they are better than everyone else, all based on the color of their skin, their religion, or both. Since the United States is surrounded by two oceans, we tend to forget that the early Americans established our capabilities to succeed. And since the 19th century, it has been the #1 destination for immigration the world over. It was the immigrants that helped to build the railroads, settle the West, build the clipper ships that would bring American goods and services to the world. Despite the early mistakes, miscues, and horrible events that cost lives, somehow it all managed to take shape, and we helped shape our nation's history. A history that sometimes conveniently is forgotten by those who choose to do so, sadly at their and our own peril. America as a whole is still the most sought-after place to live, as witnessed by the highly diverse population residing currently in contemporary America, well over 217 million people total. Despite the foolish and childish behavior of some politicians running for elected office, America is not a treasure just waiting to be plundered. America is the people, the opportunities, and the ability to bend, fold, mutilate, and spindle our society and our capabilities to do the right thing. In the words of Winston Churchill, FYI, he was half American, he said, and I quote, "Trust the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else." End of quote. In a way, he was very, very correct. We have to find our own way. It may take a while, but we will do the right thing. As we celebrate America's birthday with fireworks and barbecues all across the land, we as a people have a lot to be thankful for. We have freedoms many others only dream of. We have a set of documents that guarantee those freedoms. They are the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, the Bill of Rights. We have federal and state laws that guarantee our rights and freedoms. All of America comes from different places, different cultures. We all have different colors. We celebrate our religions in different ways. But we share one thing in common. We are free. We are free to live our lives as we see fit. That freedom does not come free. Millions have served in our armed forces for over 238 years of our existence as a country. Some have paid the ultimate price and are buried in cemeteries in America and all across the world. They heard the call. They answered as Americans have always done. Those Americans, those millions of Americans who served in the military, have served under the flag of the United States, not for Mexico or Russia or Germany or China or Japan or any other country for that matter. They served as Americans for America. But the 4th of July isn't only about barbecues, baseballs, and family get-togethers. It's about instilling the pride and patriotism for the next generation. America was never the same after the Declaration of Independence was signed. In 1791, by the way, after it was ratified by Congress. our Continental Congress. America has evolved. Our sense of pride in America, who we are, what we stand for, have been challenged recently by a president who does not believe in American ideals or American exceptionalism. We have an opportunity to regain our national identity and shed the foolish fog surrounding the one-size-fits-all mentality we are currently experiencing. That sort of thinking never did suit America or our way of life. We are a capitalistic society. We live in a country where we are constantly challenged to excel. We were told by our parents, do well in school, graduate, go to college, graduate, get a job, get married, have kids of your own. Then you must teach them to do well in school, graduate, go to college, graduate, get a job, get married, and have kids of their own, and so on and so on. Americans are challenged by a soft job market of our own making. Our professional politicians and bureaucrats helped develop the trade treaties that allowed American jobs to go offshore, according and across borders, both north and south of the United States. We've allowed ourselves to be conned, bullied, tricked by Washington, D.C. and the state capitals into thinking we need to be more like Europe. After all, they have great health care. Their insurance pays for everything. Someone forgot to mention that the insurance premiums are outrageous, and also are their taxes, since it is mandatory to have insurance, and it comes out of your taxes. Let's set the Wayback Machine to 1991. The Soviet Union broke up, and it broke up apart very quickly, with a huge military budget consisting of some estimates of over 37% of the gross domestic product of the USSR. Hence, the USSR began to split apart at the seams. Unable to stand on its own weight and the weight of the mounting debt and little ability to pay the interest, let alone the principal on the debt, the government-owned and operated industries ground to a halt. Workers sat and read newspapers or magazines with nothing to do. They had no parts to build anything. Grocery store shelves were empty. Warehouses were running out of food and supplies. Long lines for bread and other essentials were prominent in every major city and throughout the countryside in Russia, and also throughout the rural areas. Autonomy was granted first to the Baltic states, and that spread like wildfire across the entire spectrum of northern Asia. The government was the so-called communist system. Everything was done for the party and for the state. Individuals be damned. For decades, private ownership of land and industry was forbidden. In America, we've had the freedom to own land and operate businesses since the 1600s. In the USSR, the press was allowed only to broadcast government-approved news and information. In America, we have the freedom of the press since the Bill of Rights was ratified by a fledgling American Congress in 1791. In the USSR, nearly every able-bodied man and woman had a weapon to defend their homeland during the war. Those weapons were confiscated after the war by Stalin and his henchmen and the KGB. In America, the British tried to confiscate our guns in 1775. That helped to lead America into a bloody war for independence starting in 1776. So all things considered, we have the best form of government on earth, despite all the rhetorical nonsense we hear from Congress and the President's office. We just have to wrestle control of the professional politicians and the bureaucrats they employ. Keep in mind, Election Day is coming. Don't you forget it. We certainly won't. Well, that is it for another edition of Shaken Up Kenosha. Tune in next time for topics of interest to Kenosha, the surrounding communities, and hopefully you. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.